Well, good evening, everyone. The question that we're thinking about this evening is a historical one. The question we're thinking about this evening is a historical one. It's a matter of history. It's a question as to whether this event did a man called Jesus, who had died by crucifixion, appear alive again 3 days later. And I say it's a historical question, and that's just how those words that we've just read, written by the Apostle Paul around about 50 AD, that's how he treats it as well. He treats it as a historical question, and he offers the kind of evidence that you need to establish the truth of a historical event. He says there were witnesses. He says there were people that saw it. And what he also does, he also explains why this question, did Jesus rise from the dead, why it is so important. Here's just some of the words that we've just read from his first letter to the Corinthians, chapter 15. If Christ has not been raised, then our preaching is in vain. The things that Paul was doing, he was preaching and claiming that this Jesus had risen from the dead, is pointless. It was vain, and your faith is vain. And then he puts it really starkly, doesn't he? For if the dead are not raised, not even Christ has been raised. If Christ has not been raised, your faith is futile, and you are still in your sins. So it's an absolute make or break question. If Jesus didn't rise from the dead, then there is no evidence that there is any kind of supernatural power. There is no God. There's no point. There's no purpose in anything. It's all futile. But if Jesus did rise from the dead, somebody must have brought him back to life. Some supernatural power. There is a God that brought him back to life. And just the fact that he did that for a man, an innocent man like Jesus, means he's trying to tell us something. He's reaching out to us. He's a God that cares about human beings. And there is a purpose to human life. So it's an important question. But actually, I'm going to raise the stakes a little bit higher. Because actually, I'd also say that if you can be satisfied in the answer to this one question, did Jesus rise from the dead? Then all sorts of other questions about faith, all sorts of other doubts you might have, are put into their proper perspective. If you have questions about, why do scientists say certain things that don't seem to line up with what I read in the Bible? Why do historians or archaeologists say certain things that I can't quite line up with the Bible? Why is there so much suffering? How can that be the right thing and there be a God? It's good to go into those questions and try to answer those questions. But if we can say that Jesus rose from the dead and be confident in the answer to that question, then it's okay to say, do you know what? We can't fully answer those other questions. Because we can answer this one question. Jesus did rise. There is a God, and the rest is trust. So now I've raised the stakes really high. We're going to think about this question. As from a historical point of view, did Jesus rise from the dead? So this is what we're going to cover. 4 things. We're going to briefly consider the question, did Jesus even exist? Because there are people that would claim that it's just a myth, a kind of a legend that emerged out of nothing, and there was no real Jesus figure that ever existed. And then we're going to look at 2 arguments that are specifically historical arguments. They're arguments that historians use to think about and demonstrate events from the past. The minimal facts argument and the new Christian movement argument. And then the 4th thing is just a bit of a question as to, well, where does that leave us? And a bit of a reflection on that. So firstly, this question of did Jesus exist? And I'm just going to put two things side by side for you to demonstrate this. We won't spend long on this. So here is handsome chap, Julius Caesar, a ruler of Rome, and the claim is at the bottom there that he went to war. He carried out a military campaign in Gaul, in what is now France. And he wrote about it, Caesar's Gallic Wars. I've got painful memories of it because I had to study it during Latin classes at school. But how much evidence do we actually have that Caesar went to war in Gaul? We've got 10 manuscripts of his record, of his campaign in Gaul. And the oldest one that we've got dates to about 1,000 years after Caesar went to war in Gaul. Okay, so that's a long time after Caesar actually went to war in Gaul. But no one doubts that he did, do they? Now put that alongside, here's another historical character, historical event, Jesus of Nazareth. And he preached in a relatively small area of land. He was never really more than 100 miles from Jerusalem. And he was crucified. He died by crucifixion at the hands of the Romans. So what sort of evidence do we have of that? Well, we have 5,400 manuscripts, Gospels, fragments of Gospels, and other accounts of the life of Jesus and his teaching and what happened to him. 5,400 manuscripts. And the oldest of those dates to within 70 years of the time that Jesus would have lived and died. So that's a massive amount of evidence, and no one should doubt that this man Jesus really did exist. He really did preach and teach, and he really was crucified. In fact, a historian of Christianity, you can see that quote at the bottom there, John Dominic Crossan, said that Jesus was crucified under Pontius Pilate is as sure as anything historical can ever be. Okay, so that's step one. Jesus did exist, but that's not really the question we're asking, is it? Did Jesus, after that crucifixion, rise from the dead? So let's now go into those two historical arguments and look at the first of those. So the minimal facts argument, this minimal facts approach is what historians do. They'll take the minimum facts that are accepted by the vast consensus and majority of people, that just facts that aren't disputed around an event. And then they will consider possible explanations for those facts. And the historian's approach would then be the explanation that fits the fact pattern the best is the most likely explanation. Okay? So, and the way we'll look at this is there are three facts that are around the life and death and the claimed resurrection of Jesus that are pretty much undisputed. There are three facts. And there are three possible natural, what I'll call natural explanations. And we'll look at each of those. It's nice when things come in threes like that, nice and easy to remember. Apart from the Trinity, of course, but that's another subject. So, three facts that are undisputed around this matter. So the first is this, that the tomb into which the body of Jesus was placed was empty. A few days after he was placed into it, it was empty, and his body has never been produced by anyone. No one has ever said, here is the body of Jesus that died on the cross. Okay? Happy with that as a fact that people don't dispute. Second one is this, that shortly after he died, some people claimed to have seen him alive again. Okay? Not saying anything, not commenting on the validity of that claim, but just as a historical fact that is really not in dispute, some people claimed to have seen him alive again. Okay? And the third fact is this. Those same people that claimed to have seen him alive again carried on saying that they'd seen him alive again, despite being persecuted, afflicted, and many of them killed. In fact, pretty much all of the 12 apostles of Jesus were martyred, died for claiming to having seen Jesus alive again. So those are the three facts that are not disputed around this matter. So now let's go through the three explanations, the natural explanations, and see how well they fit these facts. Do they explain that combination of three facts? So here's the first one. The first one is that this was a hoax carried out by the followers of Jesus, those that had listened to his teaching. They stole his body from the tomb and then claimed that he'd risen from the dead and that they'd seen him alive again. So does that fit the three facts? So yes, it would explain why the tomb was empty and no body was ever produced to prove that he hadn't risen from the dead. It explains that. It also explains that some people did claim to have seen him alive. But does it explain that third fact, that they were persecuted and killed? So here's a group of people, let's say 12 or 100, or actually in the verses we've read, up to 500 people that had seen him at one time alive again and made that claim. And all of them, if this is the explanation, then all of those people knew that this was a lie. Okay? They knew it was a lie. They knew that Jesus hadn't risen from the dead because they'd arranged to get rid of the body and make it a hoax. They knew it was a lie. And people don't suffer persecution, affliction, and death for what they know is a lie. It just doesn't explain that third fact, does it? And so we can discount that explanation. So here's the second natural explanation. And this is often called the swoon theory. And this is that Jesus didn't actually die on the cross. And the Roman centurion who placed his spear into his side and out came blood and water only thought he was dead, placed him in the tomb, and then Jesus revived there in the tomb and was able to move away a stone from the mouth of the tomb and to escape and appear to his disciples again. Now, quite apart from the fact that centurions, I think they know how to kill people. They know where to put a spear and to kill someone. Quite apart from the fact that severely wounded and in a tomb with this heavy stone, he was able to move that. It just doesn't really add up that the body that Jesus would have escaped from the tomb. Perhaps it does explain a little bit how, if he had appeared to his disciples, even in this terribly wounded and, to be honest, about to die anyway of those injuries, that some people might have claimed to have seen him alive again. But again, if they'd have seen him in that state and nursed him until he died, they would have known that he died and they'd have disposed of the body and carried on with their claim. And we've got the same problem then with they all know it's a lie, and people don't die for a lie. And so again, it just doesn't fit the fact pattern, does it? So we can cross that one off. And then the third explanation, natural explanation that is is put forward. And these three, I've put them in just a few words and stated them quite succinctly, but every natural explanation that's been offered falls into one of those three categories, either the hoax theory, the swoon theory, or the hallucination theory. And that's this third one, that the disciples of Jesus were so stricken with grief at the loss of their master that in some way they, as a group, not just a couple of people, but not just 12 people, but as 500 people at once, experienced a hallucination and thought they saw Jesus alive again. Quite apart from the fact that group hallucinations are just not a thing, they just don't happen. Yes, an individual might have an experience of grief and think they see a loved one in some circumstances after they've died, yes. But 500 people in broad daylight in a mountain in Galilee, it's not a thing that happens. But even if it did, it doesn't fit the facts either, because what they saw was not really Jesus, it was a hallucination. And so the body of Jesus must have still been in the tomb. And so it doesn't explain the empty tomb. It explains why some people claimed to have seen him alive. They would have thought they had in that hallucination situation. And they would have really believed it. And so it perhaps explains why they might have been prepared to die for that. But it still doesn't fit all the facts. And so we have to cross that one off as well. And so we're left with the one most obvious explanation that does fit all of the facts. It fits that. It's the best explanation for this combination of facts, that the followers of Jesus did actually see him alive. Not just alive, but alive and well again, restored to health, to full health, immortality, in fact, after his resurrection. And that's the explanation, the best explanation that really fits the facts. Okay, so that's our first historical argument, the minimal facts argument. Now, here's the second one, which I've called the New Christian Movement argument. Now, this is slightly different, but it's another technique that historians use in order to think about events and explanations for events, particularly when something new emerges. When some new phenomenon happens and emerges, historians will look for what is the explanation, what is the cause, what's the explanation for that new thing that has emerged. And I've called this the New Christian Movement argument. So what new thing emerges from around about 30 AD is this movement of followers, believers in Jesus, claiming he'd risen from the dead. The Christian, what became known as the Christian movement. And what is extraordinary about this movement, first of all, it grew, it spread extremely rapidly in ancient terms. So from 30 AD to about 50 AD, which is when those words of the Apostle Paul in his letter to the Corinthians were written, that's about 20 years. But in sort of 10 to 20 years, this new Christian movement had spread through the Roman Empire, through the Roman world. I mean, that is, in ancient terms, that's going viral. For something to spread that quickly and take hold that quickly is extraordinary. But there are some particular features of the new Christian movement that we just want to highlight. Particular new and unique features, both about what they believed and about what they did, how they practiced their belief. So there's two unique new doctrines, new teachings, and then there's three unique practices that they adopted. So let's just think about them. So the first is this. This new Christian movement claimed that a resurrection of a real person has now happened. It's happened in history. There was, obviously, in Judaism, there was the concept of the resurrection at the end of days. And that's something that I can never remember whether it's Mary or Martha says to Jesus, that when their brother Lazarus had died, she says, I know that he will rise again at the last day. Yes, there was that concept of resurrection, but it's way off in the future. Now, resurrection is being redefined by this movement. It's happened. An individual has been raised from the dead. The second unique thing is a complete reshaping of what the term Messiah means. It's a term from the Old Testament, from the Jewish scriptures, from the Hebrew scriptures. It means anointed. And it was the term that the Jews used to talk about the king that would come and deliver them as a military leader from their enemies. That was the concept, the common concept of Messiah in Judaism. But now this new Christian movement was saying, no, that's not it. The Messiah is this man Jesus. And the proof of it is his resurrection. But what he did was to sacrifice himself. He gave himself. It's a reframing of the whole concept of Messiah. Now, we know it's there because we know about Jesus. We go and look in the Old Testament for it, and we know it's there. That concept of Jesus, the Messiah, as a sacrifice. But it's a new teaching that is emerging here. It's not come from Judaism. It's come from somewhere else. And the three practices, let's just run through those. So first of all, those that join this new Christian movement are baptized. That's the sign of them joining this new movement. And it's a symbol. Going down into the water is explicitly a symbol of associating with the death and then coming out of the water with the resurrection of Jesus. It's pinned to that. Every week, these members of this new Christian movement come together and they take bread and wine as symbols of the death of resurrection of Jesus. And they do this not on the Sabbath, when the Jews were resting, but on the first day of the week, the day of the resurrection. And so, and this is not just, this new Christian movement is not just some vague thing that grows, and where if you go and see some of them in Rome, then they believe this and they do that, and then you go to Jerusalem and they do believe something different, and they do different things. These are absolutely consistent. Wherever this movement sprang up in the Roman world, in that brief period, absolutely consistent. All of these things, beliefs and practices, rooted in the idea of Jesus being raised from the dead. And so historians need an explanation for that this new thing that has emerged and grown so quickly. And that, it's best explained not by something emerging, not by emerging from Judaism or from Greek philosophy. These are ideas that just don't come from there. The idea of telling a Jew to eat bread and wine as symbols of eating the body and drinking the blood of someone. That's just abhorrent to the Jewish mindset. These things don't emerge from Judaism. They're new. And they're best explained by a trigger event. So what could that trigger event be? Well, here's a comment. Sorry, there's quite a lot of text on the screen, but I think it's worth just reading this before we wrap up. This is from a lecture actually given by Professor N.T. Wright on the resurrection of Jesus as a historical problem. And I'll just read it through. This is sort of the concluding part of it. He says, what we find is the universal early Christian claim that Jesus had gone, as it were, through death and out the other side, that he was not just in some intermediate state or disembodied existence, but that his body had been transformed in a way for which they, his followers, had been quite unprepared, but with which they had had to come to terms. And they gave this, that resurrection, bodily resurrection of Jesus, they gave this as the reason why they believed his kingdom announcement had indeed reached its climax, its fulfillment in his death and resurrection. They gave this as the reason why they continued to regard him as Messiah, despite his shameful death. They gave this as the reason for saying that the resurrection had already happened. What is more, they wove this belief so firmly into their theology, their practice, their stories and their symbols that unless we're prepared to stop writing history and start writing fantasy instead, we cannot envisage their communal life without it. I propose, therefore, as the result of this broad canvas treatment of early Christianity, that there is in fact no other solution to the historical problem than to conclude that something remarkable happened to the body of Jesus. No other bridge will carry the historian across the river from one pillar to the other. Okay, so we've considered those two historian arguments. And so as the final section is just, okay, where does that leave us? So we've looked at historical facts and possible explanations and pointers and suggested the best explanation is that Jesus did rise from the dead. But it's still hard to accept, isn't it? It's still such an extraordinary thing that it's still hard to accept. You've still got to take a leap, as it were, to commit to saying, yes, Jesus did rise from the dead. I don't know whether any of you have done one of those Go Ape experiences. Yeah, Dave's nodding. I thought so. And, you're up in the treetops, standing on a platform, and I've only watched people, I've never done it. And there's a wire, a safety wire, and you're clipped onto that, and your harness is clipped onto that, and you've got to step out onto a rope bridge or a zip wire or something. And you can see all the safety things are there. You can see all the things that are pointing you to step forwards and commit. But you've still got to do it. You've got to put your foot out, and you've still got to do it. And that's I think where these historical arguments leave us. We can see all of the equipment and all of the safety lines. We can see all the evidence. We can see what the best explanation is. But we've still got to step over the edge of the cliff. Now, I got ChatGPT to draw this, so it's a little bit confused. Don't try to figure out exactly where all the ropes go. But this is kind of where we are with these historical arguments. We've still got to step forward. And yes, we can see that the facts are there. The natural explanations don't work. There is this extraordinary new movement that emerges, and it needs a trigger event that explains it. But we've still got to take a step of faith out into the unknown, as it were. But what that picture doesn't show is that if you turn round and don't step forward and look backwards, there's absolutely nothing. There's just blackness, emptiness, futility. Absolutely no point and no purpose, as we said at the beginning. And so that kind of is where I'm going to leave you. Do you step forwards or draw back into that nothingness? Well, the words that we read from the Apostle Paul, he continues and is clear in his assertion. But in fact, Christ has been raised from the dead, the first fruits of those who have fallen asleep. For as by a man came death, by a man also came the resurrection of the dead. For as in Adam all die, so also in Christ shall all be made alive. But each in his own order, Christ the first fruits, then at his coming those who belong to Christ. And if we just step forwards onto that bridge, that's the hope that lies before us. Thank you very much.